Hello and welcome to the first lecture of this new section on using AI for multi-scenario simulation. In this course, AI for mastering complexity in problem solving and decision making. So in this particular lecture, we will talk about how to use AI scenario planners like ChatGPT Advanced Data Analysis, Forethought AI or Fathom, three of them, to simulate outcomes under different assumptions. Right. So how do you think you can do that? How can you use, AI for, doing the multi-scenario simulation using these three things that we had talked about uh, earlier in the last lecture at the end. And here, let's talk about what do you think you can use to, how can you use AI scenario planners to simulate outcomes under different assumptions? Any thought? Let's take a look at a practical step-by-step guide on how to use AI scenario planning tools like ChatGPT Advanced Data Analysis, Forethought AI, Fathom, and similar systems to simulate different future outcomes under changing assumptions. Remember, different outcomes under changing assumptions because that's what the future is going to be, really, right? Just like a professional strategist or management consultant would do. And what we're going to talk to you in this lecture, you can use it immediately for business, career, decision making, operations, customer analytics, finance, and digital work, digital marketing as well, right? So let's take a look at that. Before we take a look at the process, let's take a look at how what AI scenario planning actually does. Any thoughts? AI scenario planners help you do few things. First, they help you define the assumptions, like market growth is X, customer acquisition rate is Y, churn is Z, price change is plus minus 10%, competitor enters the market, and a new policy or regulation. So you document all your assumptions, you define your assumptions in the planner. Then you model the impact, where AI calculates the revenues, profits, conversions, retentions, project timeline, risk ratings, and likelihood distribution. And then you compare the scenarios where AI then helps you to create the best case, the worst case, uh, the normal case, the black swan scenarios, strategic options, risk adjusted decisions. And please note that these tools don't try to predict the future. They may predict the future, but that's not the end. They show how different futures might behave if assumptions change, right? So let's take a look at how to use ChatGPT Advanced Data Analysis ADA for scenario. And please note that this is the most flexible and powerful scenario planner, especially for non-technical users like me. So first step is to upload the data, right? And you could have data sets like sales history, marketing performance, employee data, customer segments, website conversion funnel, or operational matrices. And then you instruct ChatGPT saying that this data represents XYZ, ABC, explain you the way. And then you say, I want to build a scenario model to explore different outcomes under different assumptions. So you explain data and say what you want to do. And then what AI does is it inspects columns, distribution patterns, and correlation. So that's the start. Step two, then you ask AI to build a simple predictive model. And you say, you by saying basically that build a baseline forecast model for next 12 months using the strongest predictors and share feature importance and a similar explanation of how the model works and anything else. So you need to be clear on what you want and accordingly you give the instruction. Now, what the AI does is that the system cleans the data, builds regression classification and time series models, evaluates the accuracy of the models and explains the variable impact. Right. So that's how it starts working. The third step is then to ask it to create a scenario table. You ask it to create a scenario table by asking create a scenario table with the columns assumption changes, predicted outcomes and confidence intervals, and risk nodes. And also you ask to provide, the best case, the worst case, a normal case, and then you will get something like what you see here. The scenarios at the top, the cases, base case, the best case, the worst case, and the different assumptions during that, and the outcome and the risk notes there. Right. So that's what happens in creating the scenario table. Then what you do is in step 4 is to run a what if scenario. And that's where you say, what if we change variables X, Y, Z, right? And then you run that, right? In which you could say, what if our churn rate rises from 5% to 12% next quarter? What if if the customer acquisition cost falls by 15%? What if we launch new product line at a 25% margin? And then you say simulate a recession scenario with 6% demand. And the AI outputs you the projected values and risk commentary. So that's how you run the what if scenario. Then you can also ask for Monte Carlo simulations for randomized future. And there, what you do is you ask, say to it to run the Monte Carlo simulation with 1,000 iterations or maybe 10,000 based on uncertainty in price elasticity, churn, and customer acquisition cost. And you ask it to show the possible outcomes and the distribution of that, and AI will then produce the probability curves of the outcomes, the percentiles if you want, confidence bands, risk levels, and this is the real strategic forecasting, right? Because future is random. Then step 6, you can all ask for a narratives of the scenario summaries. You can ask it to summarize, and you can ask it to say, you know, uh, write executive summaries for 3 plausible future scenarios, right? And ask it to, and those scenarios could be optimistic, plausible, adverse, and specifically mentioned to include drivers, triggers, risk, and strategic responses. Isn't this an excellent for presentation or board meetings? Absolutely. Let's take a look at how to use Forethought AI for scenario planning. Now, Forethought AI specializes in decision trees, strategic decision modeling, operations what if, and risk analysis. Now, how to use it? You begin obviously by uploading a data set or describing a decision environment that you want it to have work on. And then Forethought identifies key drivers and build decision trees, right? Starts working right away. You can toggle assumptions through sliders, right? And then it automatically recalculates the outcome. And you can also export comparison dashboards. Now, this is powerful, very useful for operational decisions, customer support planning, cost optimization, and workforce management. You can also use Fathom for financial modeling, where Fathom is, excellent for financial scenarios, board-ready strategic case models, cash flow projections, and KPI forecasting. Now, what is the typical workflow in Fathom? You start by connecting your Excel, CSV, QuickBooks data, right? And you ask then Fathom, and Fathom builds baseline financial forecast, and then you can change assumptions like price increase, you know, cost reduction, sales growth rates increase, staffing changes, and Fathom recalculates the cash, profit, margins, and KPI. And now you can compare multiple versions visually. So that's how Fathom works. Let's take a look at some universal prompts that you can use with any scenario tools by simply copy pasting. You could start by, let's start by scenario modeling super prompt. You start by asking, saying that what is the role, and here you see you are defining the role as a scenario analysis assistant, and then you explain your context. What situation are you analyzing? Then you ask it to build a scenario planning model for you, and you define the task. And this could be what we are saying, it could be anything else. Identifying the key assumptions and variables, creating three scenarios: best case, base case, and worst case, and quantify the outcomes under each scenario. And then ask it to allow you to change assumptions and recalculate outcomes, and show risk triggers and potential strategic responses. And if you can close the instruction by saying, ask me for any additional inputs you need, and you may be surprised. The AI scenario tool will come back. Let's take a look at how to use Monte Prompt Carlo. Let's look at a prompt to use Monte Carlo simulation. And then you need to simply say to run the Monte Carlo simulation X iterations using uncertainty range for the variables that you define, X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And the output, as an output, you ask it to show probability distribution or percentiles of outcomes and top drivers. Also, let's see the prompt for decision scenarios where you say simulate outcomes under very specific assumption shift. And then you say those mention those conditions, X increases by 20, Y falls by 10, Z remain constant, and provide a table and short, ask it to provide a table and short narrative interpretation. Let's take a look at a few examples of using AI for scenario planning. First is a digital marketing in which you say, what if I increase Facebook ad spend by 30%, but my CPC increases by 15%? And AI will do all the calculations and come back with lead, CSC, sales, ROI, and budget risk. You could also take, look at the example for HR and workforce in which you could ask it to simulate hiring 20 new employee versus improving productivity by 10%. AI will show you the differences in cost, impact on timelines, training hours, and output scenario. The third example you can look at is of operation, in which you could simply say, what if the inventory lead time increases 40% due to supply chain disruptions? And AI will output the level of stock outs, the impact on cost, delays of a customer, and what are your mitigation options. That's the most important. And last example we'll take a look at is of pricing strategy, in which you ask AI to simulate a 5, 10, and 15% price increase in demand and revenue. The impact of the 5, 10, and 15% price increase on demand and revenue, and AI will model price elasticity, volume changes, will give you the revenue curve, and give you the optimal price point. So what do we do next? We continue to look at this how to use AI for multiple scenario simulation, and we will now look at in more detail how to run Monte Carlo type simulations or risk models in Excel itself, Excel Copilot, or Python notebooks with AI. So thank you so much for watching the first lecture on AI for multi-scenario simulation. I hope you continuing to learn new things, continuing to enjoy, and I do look forward to see you again in the next lecture. Please feel free to message me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer your questions. And do download the PDF file to take a look at anything that you need to.